what do you guys think of the Stones coming and playing the Enmore Theatre?
It's great. They're playing in our backyard. Yeah, it's good.
Good. How far away from here do you guys
10
live?
minutes.
10 minutes away.
When people think of Angus Young, they picture blazing guitar solos, explosive live shows, and a total dedication to pure rock and roll. The AC/DC guitarist is famous for his high-energy performances and his no-nonsense attitude toward music. But what many fans don't realize is that Young has never been shy about sharing his honest opinions about other famous rock bands, even when those opinions are brutally harsh. Throughout his career, Young has made it clear that he believes rock music should be about raw talent, powerful energy, and genuine musicianship. He has little patience for bands that he thinks rely too heavily on gimmicks, theatrics, or commercial appeal, instead of focusing on what he considers the true essence of rock and roll. This strong belief has led him to criticize some of the biggest names in rock history, delivering opinions that are just as intense as his guitar playing. The punk rock movement and the Ramones. The punk rock movement of the 1970s was widely praised for bringing rock music back to its basic roots. Many music critics and fans celebrated bands like the Ramones for their simple, high-energy approach that stripped away all the complicated elements that had crept into rock music during the early 70s. However, Angus Young was not impressed by what punk rockers were doing. Young believed that punk bands like the Ramones were not creating anything new or revolutionary. Instead, he thought they were simply copying what earlier rock bands had already done, particularly groups like the Small Faces and the Faces. These bands had been playing raw, rough-edged rock music long before punk became popular. In Young's view, punk rockers were just taking the unpolished sound of these earlier bands and making it their entire identity, but without the musical skill or depth that made those original bands special. Young was especially critical of He Ramones themselves. After listening to one of their songs, he dismissed them completely, saying that their music reminded him of his first band when he was 12 years old, except that his childhood band was actually better. This harsh comparison showed just how little Young thought of the Ramones' musical abilities. To him, they sounded like amateur musicians who were still learning how to play their instruments, rather than professional artists who deserved the praise they were receiving. The AC/DC guitarist's criticism of punk went beyond just the Ramones. He had problems with the entire punk movement because he felt that while these bands had plenty of attitude and energy, they lacked the technical skill that he believed was essential for good rock music. Young argued that it was easy for any musician to go on stage and play simple, aggressive music, but the real challenge was being able to actually play your instrument well. For Young, rock music had always required more than just a rebellious spirit. It needed talent, precision, and genuine musicianship. While he acknowledged that punk bands had energy and attitude, he felt they were missing the musical complexity and skill that made bands like AC/DC, the Small Faces, and the Faces stand out from the crowd. In his opinion, the rise of punk was not a positive evolution of rock music, but actually a step backward that valued raw energy over real musical ability. Kiss and the Problem with Theatrics, AC/DC, and Kiss were both hugely successful rock bands during the 1970s and 1980s, and they were often compared to each other because of their powerful stage presence and memorable songs. However, despite these comparisons, Angus Young never had any respect for Kiss as a band. The fundamental difference between the two groups came down to their approach to live performance and what they believed rock music should be as. Young was a strong believer that rock music should focus on pure energy, musicianship, and attitude. He thought that great rock bands didn't need elaborate costumes, special effects, or theatrical gimmicks to entertain their audiences. Kiss, on the other hand, built their entire brand around over-the-top stage performances that included face paint, fire-breathing stunts, blood-spitting acts, and elaborate pyrotechnics. To Young, all of these theatrical elements were just a way for Kiss to hide the fact that they weren't strong enough musicians to hold an audience's attention with their music alone. He believed that if a band needed gimmicks and special effects to entertain people, then their songs weren't good enough to stand on their own. This represented a completely different philosophy from what Kiss was doing. AC/DC took the opposite approach to live performance. They focused on delivering raw power, electrifying guitar work, and high-energy music without any elaborate stage tricks. Young and his bandmates believed that great rock music should speak for itself, and that audiences should be captivated by the songs and the musicians' talent, not by flashy distractions. The clearest example of AC/DC's attitude toward Kiss came when the two bands had the opportunity to tour together. Gene Simmons, who was one of the founding members of Kiss, later revealed that AC/DC had been offered the chance to go on tour with them, but AC/DC turned down the offer. According to Simmons, AC/DC rejected the opportunity because they felt that Kiss's theatrical presentation was too different from the stripped-down, no-nonsense rock that AC/DC represented. Despite Kiss's enormous commercial success and their millions of devoted fans around the world, Young never saw them as equals in terms of musical credibility. To him, Kiss represented a version of rock music that was more concerned with image and spectacle than with substance and genuine musical talent. While many people loved Kiss's larger-than-life personas and exciting stage shows, Young remained completely unimpressed, believing that real rock bands should be able to command an audience through their music alone, without needing face paint or elaborate stage tricks. In the end, both bands became legendary in their own ways, but they followed completely different paths. Kiss became known as one of the most theatrical rock bands in history, while AC/DC built their reputation on delivering some of the most straightforward, hard-hitting rock songs ever recorded. For Angus Young, this distinction was extremely important because in his world, rock and roll was supposed to be about the music first and foremost, not about putting on a show. Deep Purple and personal conflicts. Angus Young's dislike of Deep Purple was not just based on their music, but also on a negative personal experience that left a lasting impression on him. This conflict happened during a festival appearance at Sunbury, where the road crews of AC/DC and Deep Purple had some kind of disagreement. While the exact details of what happened have never been fully explained, the tension from this incident was enough to strengthen Young's already negative opinion of the band. In an interview with Guitar World magazine, Young was very direct about his criticism of Deep Purple. He recalled going to see them perform live, expecting to enjoy a powerful rock concert from a band that many people considered to be one of the best in the business. Instead of being impressed, however, he left the show feeling disappointed and frustrated. Young said that he had paid his own money to see Deep Purple perform, but he thought their concert was ridiculous and not worth the price of admission. To Young, Deep Purple's performance seemed fake and unconvincing. He felt that their grand stage presence and theatrical elements were just smoke and mirrors, designed to distract people from the fact that the band wasn't as good as their reputation suggested. This criticism extended beyond just their live shows to their music in general. Young made it clear that he had never been a fan of Deep Purple's approach to rock music. He admitted that he had always disliked their style and never understood why so many people considered them to be influential or important. While many music fans and critics viewed Deep Purple as one of the pioneering bands of hard rock and early heavy metal, Young was definitely not among their supporters. One of Young's most cutting remarks about Deep Purple was when he called them a poor man's Led Zeppelin. This comparison was particularly harsh because it suggested that Deep Purple was just a cheap imitation of a superior band. To Young, Deep Purple lacked the authenticity and raw energy that he valued most in rock music. While the band had built a strong reputation for their heavy guitar riffs and virtuosic performances, especially through the work of guitarist Ritchie Blackmore and keyboardist John Lord, Young saw them as overly theatrical and lacking the organic, gritty quality that bands like AC/DC represented. Young's criticism also reflected his broader attitude toward the direction that rock music was taking during that era. While Deep Purple, like Led Zeppelin, was associated with a more technical and sometimes experimental approach to hard rock, Young was a firm believer in the straightforward blues-influenced sound that AC/DC championed. His dismissal of Deep Purple as an inferior version of Led Zeppelin showed not just his personal taste, but also his skepticism toward bands that relied too heavily on technical complexity and presentations, rather than raw power and simplicity. Even decades later, Deep Purple continued to be regarded as one of the pioneering bands of hard rock and heavy metal, while AC/DC carved out their own legendary status with their stripped-down, high-energy approach. Despite both bands achieving success in rock history, Young's opinion of Deep Purple never changed, remaining based on both his negative personal experience and his fundamental disagreement with their musical philosophy. Led Zeppelin and live performance issues. Even before AC/DC became internationally famous, Angus Young was bold enough to criticize bands that were already considered rock legends. One of the most surprising targets of his criticism was Led Zeppelin, widely regarded as one of the most influential and important rock bands of all time. While most people viewed Led Zeppelin as a groundbreaking group that had completely redefined what rock music could be, Young had a much less favorable opinion of their live performances. In an interview with Classic Rock magazine, Young shared his experience of attending a Led Zeppelin concert and being left unimpressed by what he saw. Led Zeppelin was famous for their long, improvisational live shows that could stretch for hours, featuring extended solos and complex musical passages. However, Young felt that much of their performance was boring and unnecessarily drawn out. Young bluntly stated that while Led Zeppelin played for 3 hours, they bored the audience for 2.5 of those hours. He found it puzzling that a band with such a massive reputation and so much talent could fail to keep the crowd engaged throughout their entire show. For Young, this was a serious problem, because he believed that the essence of great rock and roll was maintaining constant energy and excitement. While Led Zeppelin's concerts were technically impressive and featured moments of pure musical virtuosity, Young saw these extended solos and complex musical explorations as distractions, rather than enhancements to the rock experience. He expressed frustration that a group with such influence and skill could fall into what he viewed as self-indulgent excess, saying that they should be the most exciting band in the world, but somehow weren't delivering on that potential. Young's criticism wasn't entirely unique, as Led Zeppelin had occasionally been called out by other people for inconsistent live performances. Some concert-goers felt that their extended jams and sprawling set lists lacked the same tight energy that defined their studio recordings. For Young, this inconsistency was an unforgivable flaw because he believed that rock and roll should always be direct, hard-hitting, and filled with relentless energy. To Young, Led Zeppelin seemed to be going through the motions of being a great rock band rather than actually igniting the true spirit of rock and roll. While they had all the elements that should have made them exciting, the reputation, the talent, the aura of greatness, their live performances failed to deliver the raw excitement and immediate impact that he valued most in rock music. This perspective highlighted a fundamental difference in musical philosophy between the two approaches. Led Zeppelin embraced sprawling compositions and elaborate musical exploration, taking their audiences on long, complex musical journeys. AC/DC, on the other hand, built their identity on stripped-down, no-nonsense rock that never lost momentum and always kept the energy level high from start to finish. Despite their different approaches, both bands secured their places in rock history as legendary acts. However, Young's views about Led Zeppelin remained unchanged throughout his career. He was never someone who could be swayed by reputation alone or by what other people thought about a band. For him, a band's greatness had to be proven on stage night after night by keeping the audience engaged and delivering an unrelenting, high-energy experience. By that standard, Led Zeppelin simply didn't measure up to his expectations. The glam metal movement and commercial rock. During the 1980s, the rock music scene was dominated by what became known as glam metal or hair metal. Bands like Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, Poison, and Def Leppard became massively popular during this era, bringing a more polished and radio-friendly sound to hard rock. While there may not be direct quotes from Angus Young specifically targeting Bon Jovi, it was well known that AC/DC as a band had very little respect for this entire glam metal movement. The glam metal bands of the 1980s were characterized by several elements that AC/DC found objectionable. Their music often featured big, catchy hooks designed for radio play, slick production values, power ballads that appealed to mainstream audiences, and a heavy emphasis on image and visual presentation. All of these elements represented everything that AC/DC viewed as the opposite of what real rock and roll should be. For AC/DC, rock music was supposed to be gritty, straightforward, and built on pure musicianship and talent. Throughout their career, they had always prided themselves on being a band that could walk into any recording studio, plug in their instruments, and deliver the same raw energy and power that they brought to their live performances. They didn't need elaborate stage productions, synthesizers, or image-driven marketing campaigns to sell their music. Bands like Bon Jovi, however, fully embraced the glitzy, highly produced aesthetic that defined the glam metal era. They spent considerable time and money on their appearance, their music videos, and their stage shows, creating a polished product that was designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. One of the biggest differences between AC/DC and the glam metal bands was their approach to songwriting and production. While AC/DC remained committed to their blues-based, hard-hitting rock formula, bands like Bon Jovi often incorporated power ballads and polished anthems that were specifically designed for mainstream radio appeal. Songs like Livin' on a Prayer and You Give Love a Bad Name became massive hits and helped define the sound of the 1980s, but to rock purists like the members of AC/DC, these songs felt too polished, too commercialized, and ultimately lacking the raw, unfiltered power that defined true rock and roll. Another factor that contributed to AC/DC's dismissive attitude toward the glam metal scene was the emphasis these bands placed on image and visual presentation. The elaborate hairstyles, the flashy outfits, the music videos filled with typical rock star cliches. All of this was completely different from AC/DC's stripped-down, working-class approach to music. Unlike the spandex-clad bands of the 1980s, AC/DC didn't need hairspray, makeup, or elaborate stage productions to prove their rock and roll credibility. They believed in the power of loud guitars, pounding drums, and high-energy performances, and they felt that these musical elements should be enough to carry any rock band. The success of glam metal bands during the 1980s represented a trend toward commercialization that AC/DC had always resisted. While these bands sold millions of records and filled stadiums around the world, AC/DC viewed their success as evidence that the rock moustes. IC industry was moving away from authenticity and toward a more manufactured, image-driven approach that prioritized commercial appeal over musical substance. The Rolling Stones and musical evolution. In a 1977 interview with Classic Rock magazine, Angus Young openly criticized the Rolling Stones, one of the most respected and influential bands in rock history. His criticism focused on what he saw as the band's departure from their original rock and roll roots. Young expressed frustration that the Rolling Stones, who had once been a defining force in rock music, had begun incorporating more soul and R&B influences into their sound during the mid-1970s. While many music critics and fans praised the Rolling Stones for their musical evolution and their willingness to explore different genres and styles, Young was completely unimpressed by this development. He believed that the band was moving away from what they did best, which was playing gritty, hard-edged rock music that had made them famous in the first place. Young stated bluntly that the Rolling Stones had started playing soul music instead of rock and roll, and he made it clear that he disapproved of this musical direction. To him, rock music had a distinct energy and attitude that should not be diluted or compromised by mixing it with other musical styles. While he acknowledged that soul music was important and respected its cultural origins, he felt that it was best performed by the artists who had created it and who truly understood its essence. Young's comments reflected his belief that musicians should stick to what they do best, rather than trying to branch out into areas where they might not be as effective. He argued that if the Rolling Stones focused on playing the kind of blues-based rock music that had initially made them successful, they would be much better performers and would feel more comfortable and natural in their performances. In his view, their attempts to incorporate other musical styles felt forced and unnecessary, since they already had a natural talent for playing straightforward rock and roll. These comments revealed Young's broader philosophy about music and artistic integrity. Throughout AC/DC's entire career, the band had remained fiercely dedicated to their signature sound, never straying far from their blues-based, hard-hitting rock formula. While some critics had occasionally accused AC/DC of being repetitive or predictable, Young saw their consistency as a strength rather than a weakness. He believed that staying true to their musical identity was more important than following trends or trying to appeal to different audiences. Young's critique of the Rolling Stones suggested that he expected the same level of consistency and dedication from other legendary rock bands. He felt that bands who had established themselves as masters of a particular style should continue to focus on that style, rather than experimenting with different approaches that might not suit their strengths. At the time of Young's comments, the Rolling Stones were indeed in the midst of a significant musical evolution. Their sound had expanded well beyond the raw blues rock that had defined their early years, and they were incorporating elements of funk, disco, and soul music, as heard on albums like Black and Blue from 1976 and Some Girls from 1978. While this musical shift helped them stay relevant in a rapidly changing music landscape and introduced their music to new audiences, it also drew mixed reactions from longtime fans. Some fans, like Young, wished that the Rolling Stones would return to the sound that had originally made them famous. Others appreciated the band's willingness to evolve and experiment with new musical directions. This division among fans highlighted the challenge that many long-established bands face when trying to balance artistic growth with fan expectations. Despite his criticisms, the Rolling Stones and AC/DC would go on to develop a mutual respect over the years, and both bands became icons of rock music while maintaining their own distinct approaches to the genre. However, Young's comments from 1977 serve as an important reminder of his unwavering dedication to authentic rock and roll. Throughout his career, he was never afraid to challenge even the biggest names in music if he felt they were losing sight of what had made them great in the first place. To Young, the essence of rock music was simple, powerful, and unfiltered, and he expected nothing less from the bands that had helped shape and define the genre. His criticism of the Rolling Stones was not meant to diminish their overall contribution to rock music, but rather to encourage them to return to the musical approach that he felt showcased their talents most effectively. Conclusion: Angus Young's harsh criticisms of these legendary rock bands reveal a musician who has always been uncompromising in his vision of what rock and roll should be. Whether he was dismissing the Ramones as amateur, criticizing Kiss for relying on theatrics, calling Deep Purple a poor imitation, finding Led Zeppelin boring, rejecting the glam metal movement, or telling the Rolling Stones to stick to their roots, Young's opinions have remained consistent throughout his career. For Young, authentic rock music should be built on raw talent, genuine energy, and straightforward musicianship. He has never had patience for bands that he believes rely on gimmicks, excessive commercialization, or unnecessary complexity to hide a lack of genuine musical substance. While his opinions may seem harsh, they reflect a deep commitment to maintaining the integrity and authenticity of rock and roll as an art form.